Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another Stryd coaching webinar. As always, my name is Evan. Super excited to be putting on another one of these. Today, I am joined by Rebecca Johansson, and we are so excited to talk about a multifactorial approach to preparing for races beyond 50 kilometers. It feels like my mouth just did an ultra reading out the title and jumping through all the different words in the title. But we're so excited to take a look at this case study. Rebecca, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Evan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing that we've talked about a couple times in the past Stryd webinars is that these webinars are designed for Stryd coaches to not only learn more about power-based training, power-based racing strategies, but really to get inside the mind of an expert level coach. And we are super excited to have you on today to talk not only about your history of coaching and the history of, kind of how you got into the sport and how you approach things, but the other things that any coach, and specifically power-based coaches, have to keep in mind, whether that's nutrition or those ancillary things outside. And so the scope of this specific presentation and webinar is going to include lots and lots of stuff about power, about training, about racing. But as the title implies, there are multiple factors that go into things, and especially as you stretch out that race distance and that goal target, more and more factors come into play. So Rebecca, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm super excited to be following along. I might pop in with questions here and there, but we do have a couple questions at the end that we're super excited to be able to ask from our Stryd coaches and community. But without further ado, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. So as Evan said, we're going to be talking about the ultramarathon distance today, and I'm going to be presenting the presentation as a case study. So just a little bit of background about my sports science background. I did my master's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and you can see that picture in the top left. That's Bascom Hall in the winter. My master's, I studied vascular health and obesity and metabolic syndrome. After I graduated with my master's, I did a combination of teaching and coaching for a few years, but ultimately decided that I wanted to go back to school to pursue my PhD. So I did my PhD at the University of Cape Town, and you can see that picture in the bottom left. So that's the rugby pitch on Upper Campus. So I learned a bit about rugby. And then you can see Table Mountain in the background, which I spent nearly every weekend running on. And my PhD thesis was on the interactions between training load, performance, and submaximal heart rate in endurance runners. And while I did my PhD, I was lucky enough to also work part-time at the Sports Performance Center, and that was based at the Sports Science Institute of South Africa. So I did coaching. And the really great thing about that building, about the Sports Science Institute, is that under one roof, the exercise science department at UCT was based there. The sports medicine physicians were based there, physical therapist, sports massage, fitness center, obviously the sports performance center. So everything that an athlete would need was based in one building. So for me, I was able to really develop my skill set as a coach while I was there. And then what I learned during my PhD from my research and while I was doing the research studies, I was able to actually apply to my coaching right away. So that was just a really fantastic 4 years for me, and I greatly enjoyed that experience. So towards the end of my PhD, I ultimately decided that I did want to coach full time because that is ultimately why I went back to school, was to be a better coach. So I started the Performance Project, and we do running and triathlon coaching, but more heavily based in the running sphere. So running, road running and trail running, anywhere from 5K to 200-mile races. And we specialize in custom coaching. So I really like getting to know each individual athlete and figuring out what type of training is going to lead to their optimal performance. So that's what we specialize in. And just a brief background about the athlete that I'm going to be talking about for the case study. It's a 42-year-old male runner, and he started running in 2007. So he's been running for several years. Most of his racing experience has been at the half marathon distance and shorter. He has a recent PR at the half marathon distance of 1:21. So for a recreational athlete in his 40s, I would consider him to be pretty high achieving. He has run 3 marathon distances. The first marathon he did was London Marathon a few years ago, but it was a really hot day. So ultimately, he just wasn't able to perform to his ability on that day. And then the second 2 marathons that he ran actually was under COVID lockdown. So they were both virtual, and he ran them by himself, but he was able to do a PR and did a 3:11 recently in March. And he's run one 50K distance, and that was also a virtual event during COVID lockdown, and that was in April. So the next big goal that he has is to do the Thames Path Challenge 100K race, and that's scheduled to be in September. And something that we talk a lot about at the Performance Project is, what is your happy weekly mileage? So I define that as a weekly mileage that the athlete can sustain for several weeks in a row without getting an overuse injury and without fatigue building up too much. So for this athlete, his happy weekly mileage is 50 miles per week in approximately 6 runs per week. So the ultimate question that we want to answer in this case study is, how do we successfully prepare this runner for the 100K ultramarathon distance, which is going to be a new distance for him? So when we get to these really long distances, the multifactorial approach in order to achieve success at these distances becomes even more important than 42K and shorter. So today we're going to be discussing training load, pacing strategy, nutrition, logistics and support, and psychology. So when I look at the multifactorial approach, what I try and figure out is, what are the missing pieces? So, where do we need to focus our energies in the next several months in order for him to be successful at this 100K race? So I grabbed a couple of screenshots from his Training Peaks account. So the bar graph on the top is his weekly mileage the last 6 months. So, okay, we can see that the average was 40 miles per week, but that obviously includes recovery weeks and weeks where, maybe he was out of town and didn't really run. But we can see that 40 to 50 mile per week is something that's really sustainable for him. And I don't find that to be a missing piece. So that's not going to be a focus, increasing his weekly mileage, because it's already sufficient for preparing for an ultramarathon. We may have to do a few, what I call microcycles, where we do heavier volume, but certainly not increasing his happy weekly mileage, because this is a recreational runner. He has a family, he has an intense career. So that's going to be sufficient for this athlete. But then the bar graph on the bottom is his longest workout per week for the last 6 months. So this is really where we get into one of those missing pieces. So his longest run in the last 6 months was the 50K, was the virtual 50K that he did, and it took him roughly 4 hours. So this is going to be a big thing for this athlete, is that he's going to be more than doubling the time on his legs for this 100K race. So that's going to be pretty huge. So the way I approach this is we do something at the Performance Project called 4-day blocks. So we know that time on legs is going to be an issue for this athlete. He doesn't have experience at the 100K distance. So we're going to strategically put 4-day blocks throughout his training. And we always have a recovery week or an easy week before the week where we do a 4-day block, and then a recovery week after. And the goal of these 4-day blocks is time on legs. So it would be to get in a high volume in these 4 days. And also we want to take in specificity in terms of race terrain. So the case study athlete hasn't done a 4-day block yet, but the screenshot that I grabbed from Training Peaks is from another athlete at the Performance Project, and you can see an example of what they do. So for this athlete, he was preparing for 110K self-supported mountain adventure, mountain challenge. So in the 4 days, he did a total of 80 Ks. And then we also had vertical gain or climbing goals for each day. So instead of focusing on one singular long run and building up that one super long run in training, the 4-day block, they get more time on their legs. They're able to get more distance in, and they also recover quicker. So this is something that has worked for a number of athletes, ultra runners particularly on our team, and is something that I'm going to be including in this case study athlete specific preparation for the 100K. So the other thing in terms of training is really looking at specificities. So very early on, I like to study the race. I look at the GPS file, the elevation gain, what type of terrain is the race. So this is a screen grab from the Strava file of the race. So the race starts in West London and it goes to Henley. So it follows the Thames. The surface is either paved or crushed gravel. So it's not technical. It's not a mountain race. On the Strava file, it says that the total elevation gain for the 100Ks is 145 meters. On the race website, they say 350 meters, and it's going to vary so much depending on, which watch people use. But in total for 100Ks, that's not a lot of climbing, but we do have to consider that, it gradually ticks up as the race goes on. And we know, when fatigue sets in, even a small gradient up does hit you pretty hard. The case study athlete is based in Cambridge. So, he's not going to have to go do any mountain trips to do some race specific terrain. So that's not going to be a major issue in his training. So now we're going to move into pacing strategies. So at the ultramarathon distance, I like for my ultra runners to be comfortable talking about power, pace, and RPE in terms of pacing strategy, because depending on the event, we're going to be utilizing one over the other, or maybe relying on power more in the first half and then RPE in the second half. So I really like for my athletes to be comfortable in a number of different areas. But we're first going to talk about the power. So what was nice about this athlete was, because of lockdown, he did a number of time trials and virtual events in his hometown. So we got a lot of good data in a short amount of time. So in this graph on the left y-axis is relative power. So 100% would be his critical power. And then on the x-axis, we have running time in minutes. And on the right y-axis are the 5 Stryd power zones. So we can see from left to right, the bars is his 30-minute time trial, his virtual half marathon, which he PB'd, the marathon distance, and the 50K. So where this comes into play and becomes a really great tool in terms of pacing for the 100K race is it's going to allow him to not go out too hard or too fast. So basically, we can look at this graph and say, okay, at the 50K, your average power that you held was kind of mid zone 2. So we know if at the 100K race, if he's in the first 20Ks, if he's sprinting off in zone 3, we know that he's going to redline, and his pacing profile is he's going to slow down way too much in the second half. So it becomes this guideline where we know, hey, you're going to need to be sticking into zone 1, lower end of zone 2, maybe. for power. So it becomes this nice kind of guideline so that he can pace smart and not go out too quickly, because it's so easy to go out too quickly at the ultramarathon distances. And then in terms of pace, the goal is going to be to minimize slowing down in the second half as much as possible. But a positive pacing profile is going to be likely, especially because he's going to be new at this distance. He's pretty new to ultramarathon running. And I know of very few athletes that I've worked with that have managed to, negative split 100K races. So we're just wanting to create a pacing strategy where he doesn't slow down as much in the second half as if we didn't have a good strategy. And then we're going to talk about RPE. So I really like RPE, rating of perceived exertion. At the Performance Project, we use a modified Borg scale. So we use the 0 to 10. It's a little bit easier for athletes to digest, and we don't use heart rate as much just because people don't have chest strap monitors. Not as many people do these days. So what I created, you can see the infographic, and I created little taglines for people to help understand, because athletes sometimes will think that 1 means 10% and 5 means 50% of your max and 10 means 100%, but it's not. It's a logarithmic scale. So RPE1 would be like a leisurely walk. So walk through the park, or you're walking your dog, that's RPE1. RPE 2 to 3 would be I could hold this pace all day. RPE 3 to 4 would be I could hold this pace for several hours. And then once you get up to RPE 5 to 6, that's going to be a marathon race effort. RPE 7 is a really nice tagline. That would be something that you could sustain for 1 hour. And then RPE 9, something that you could sustain for 1 kilometer. And then RPE 10 is kind of that sprint to the finish line, something that you could sustain for 1 minute. So when we look at the 100K race, we're going to be splitting it up into 30-kilometer sections and then the last 10Ks. So the first 30Ks, I'm going to tell the athlete to stick to RPE 2 to 3. So, you're loving life at this point. You're talking to the other competitors. You're stopping to take a few pictures. You're eating your snacks. Things are just feeling super smooth and easy in the first 30Ks. And then from the 30K to 60K section, it moves up to RPE 3 to 4. So it's important to distinguish that even though the RPE, the perceived effort, increases as the race goes on, that doesn't necessarily mean that your speed is increasing. And that's because things like muscular fatigue, cardiovascular drift. So there's physiological variables that come into play as you move through the race distance, where the same pace is going to feel harder as the distance goes on. So I always explain that to my athletes as well. This doesn't mean that you're increasing your speed as the race goes on. So from 30 to 60Ks, that's going to be RPE 3 to 4, where you're kind of feeling like, okay, I could hold this for, several hours. And he's going to go through the 50K point, and it's going to go through his head. It's like, wow, I'm only halfway done and I'm already in new territory in terms of a distance. So, you'll be fatigued because you've already run an ultramarathon at that point. So that middle section is kind of important one to kind of keep the effort controlled, keep your breathing controlled, stick to your nutrition plan. And then from 60 to 90Ks, we move up again. That's going to be RPE 5 to 6. Things are really starting to get tough. You might have to, start relying on some of your mantras. Make sure that you're taking your breaks at the aid station, get refueled, get your feet taken care of. And then the final 10Ks is really where I say, okay, you're going to finish this thing. Try and actually increase your speed at this point. and run pretty hard. So it's RPE 7 to 8. So that's how we're going to split up the race in terms of a pacing strategy. So power will come into play in terms of helping him not go out too quickly. Pace will not really come into play in terms of a pacing strategy. It will be more something that he'll just keep an eye on his watch in terms of thinking about projected finishing time and helping his crew. And then RPE is going to be relied on heavily for his pacing strategy. Okay, so nutrition is hugely important in endurance running. And at the ultramarathon distance, if your nutrition doesn't go to plan, it can ultimately end your race and you would have a DNF. So the biggest thing that I emphasize with my athletes is that we have to track what you're doing for nutrition on your long runs and in your races leading up to target races. So I encourage them on their long runs and on races. I say, okay, in the post-activity comments and training peaks, write down what you actually took in on that long run. What products did you use? When did you take them? How much of it did you take? And then we calculate the calories per hour that they took in and carbohydrate per hour. Because physiological variability is huge. So we have to figure out how is this individual athlete going to create a nutrition strategy that works for them. So for this athlete, his nutrition list is pretty short because, you know, most of the longer distances are really new to him. So right now, his nutrition list includes Cliff Shot Blocks, SIS gels, jelly babies or jelly beans, Kendall mint cake, which is a type of candy, and Lucozade drink, which is an energy drink. So his nutrition list is really short. So one of the missing pieces that we want to focus on throughout the next several months is we want to expand his food options or his nutrition list to include more real food, because that's going to provide a more consistent energy source for a distance like the 100K. So we really need to start working on expanding that list and including more real foods, more complex carbohydrates. So far, on his long training runs and the marathon he did in the 50K, he's been able to take in a range of 140 to 212 calories per hour and 37 to 52 grams of carbs per hour. So I would say from the athletes that I coach, that's pretty standard, and it's pretty good. So in terms of looking at it from a fueling standpoint in terms of calories and carbs, I think he's doing pretty good. We just need to expand that nutrition list. So on the far right, the table, the black and gray table, is a table that I've taken out from one of Louise Burke's research papers. And she's a world-leading expert in sports nutrition, and I like to refer to her research. So there's just 2 points that I'll make from it. For endurance exercise, she defined it as 1 to 2.5 hours. The carbohydrate target that she listed was 30 to 60 grams per hour. And she commented that the athlete should practice to find a refueling plan that suits their individual goals, including hydration needs and gut comfort. So gut comfort is really where I find individual variability comes into play. Not all athletes are going to be able to take in 60 to 90 grams per hour. We may never get them there. That's just something that their bodies just ultimately don't want to do. And there's a huge range for that reason. We just don't know what that individual is going to be able to tolerate. We can work to improve it and make sure that we maximize their physiological potential. So that's the standpoint that I like to take. And then for ultra endurance exercise, she defines it as, a time frame that's greater than 2.5 hours. And then the carbohydrate target can increase up to 90 grams per hour. So she commented that higher intakes of carbohydrate are associated with better performance, and products providing multiple transportable carbohydrates, such as glucose fructose mixtures, achieve high rates of oxidation of carbohydrate consumed during exercise. So this is where expanding this athlete's nutrition list comes into play. We want that glucose fructose mixtures so that we can maximize how many carbs he can get in per hour. The other point with this athlete is his hydration. So he really doesn't get thirsty. Even on long runs, he may carry water, but he doesn't actually drink any water. So I'll be interested to see how it plays out in the summer months with it being warmer outside now, if he does get a bit more thirsty. So the first prize would be for him to actually get to a sports science lab and do a sweat test so that we can actually see what is his volume of sweat, what's the composition of his sweat, so that we can tailor his hydration needs. Not everyone is going to have access to a lab or be able to afford a test like that. So second prize would be for him to weigh himself after long runs and compare that to a hydrated weight. So that would be like 3 days where you take the average, and it's when you're not dehydrated and when you're not overhydrated, and compare that weight and see how much he's losing on these long runs. And also urine monitoring has some nice applicable needs. So I tell athletes, think about how thirsty are you when you wake up in the morning. Look at the color of your urine, especially in the morning. So for this athlete, we definitely need to increase his drinking. But of course, we have to be careful because I don't actually know how much he's sweating or the composition of his sweat. And, you can overhydrate, but he certainly does need to increase it. So that's something that we have to work on in the next several months. Logistics and support. I love this aspect of ultramarathon running. I love studying the course routes. I love studying aid stations and talking about their crew and pacers and how to get it all right. That's just like a puzzle piece that I really enjoy. So things that I look at is for each specific race, the aid station. So how many aid stations are there and what do they offer? So what they offer is going to influence the athlete's nutrition strategy. And this is like where it comes into play. So this race is so well supported. I mean, they're going to be offering hot meals at 2 different points. So this is where, okay, if this athlete hasn't ever taken in real food on long runs, how is a hot meal going to go down? That's a bit risky. So that's why I would really like to expand that food list so that maybe, he could have a hot meal, or his crew would be able to provide something a bit more savory, something with more calories for when he actually takes a little bit of a longer break at that aid station. I also look at pacers. So does the race allow pacers? Because that's going to affect your pacing strategy. Support crew. Where can spectators or support crew, which aid stations can they go to? Because that's going to affect what this athlete is going to end up carrying. It's going to affect his nutrition strategy. So if crew isn't allowed, then he definitely is going to have to rely on whatever the aid stations are offering. And we're going to have to figure out what that is and then have him practice taking in those specific foods or drinks so that he can practice that. Gear, of course, we could talk about that all day, but it's things like, shoes, socks, running pack, clothes. Are you going to use trekking poles? Are you not going to use poles? So yeah, that's obviously an aspect in terms of logistics and support. Blisters really come into play at the ultramarathon distance, and it can end your run. For this specific athlete, after his virtual marathon and the 50K, he did develop a pretty big blister underneath his big toenail. And that lasted about a week. So he did have pain while he was running for about a week. And it kind of calmed down after that. But for example, I've thought about, okay, what if this blister underneath this big toenail comes up, at the 50K point? What are we going to do? What's going to be the strategy? So we need to talk about that. And then finally, like upset tummy. What are you going to do if your body just doesn't want to actually do the nutrition strategy that we came up with? That's always a possibility. Maybe you get nauseous and you just can't take in any calories. The first, point of advice that I tell athletes is, okay, we know that to finish the 100K distance, you have to continue to take in calories and carbohydrates. So if you get nauseous or upset tummy, the first thing you do is you slow down. Just slow down, take a break, and hopefully it would calm down and you would be able to start taking in some calories again. So sports psychology, these are, as coaches, we have conversations with athletes about their doubts and anxieties and fears around races. For the new ultramarathon runners, something that comes up a lot in our conversations is that the distance between their longest training run or their previous race, and in this example, the 100K distance, there's a huge gap there. So, I mean, it's really mind-boggling to be like, oh, I'm just going to double the longest distance that I've ever run. So that's something that we have discussions about early, and we continue kind of checking in. And it is a mental hurdle, but the body can go a lot further than you think it can. And an exercise that we do, that I have my athletes do, is I say, okay, the 100K distance, yes, it's far, but let's tally up all of the kilometers, all of the miles that you've done in training for preparation for this race. And when you look at the 100K distance as a percentage of the total training volume that you've done in preparation, it no longer looks like such a big number. So we really emphasize that, hey, it's not about the longest run you've ever done. It's really about the total amount of volume that you've done in preparation for this race. And that's normally a pretty big confidence boost for the athletes. Another exercise that I have my athletes do that I actually got from The Brave Athlete, which is a book written by Simon Marshall and Leslie Patterson. And it's a fantastic book, and I highly recommend it. Is I have them write down their anxieties or doubts or worries about the race. And then beside that, write the rationale for why they aren't true, or what you're going to do if a scenario that you're worried about or anxious about actually comes to play in the race. So maybe, this athlete is worried about getting an upset tummy because he's going to eat like more real food. What's going to be, if that happens, what's the plan that we've come up with? So actually writing it down, and then the athletes realizing that either their fear or worry is irrational and it's not true at all. Like, oh, I haven't done enough training. And then you write down, oh, actually, I have done a lot of training. Hey, this might happen, but this is the plan that we're going to execute if it does happen. Helps, calm the nerves and helps us just stay rational. And because we all get nervous before races and we all have doubts. So that was an exercise that I really liked from that book. And then finally, we talk about getting through the low points of the race. So in ultramarathon running, you're going to hit those low points. I think what can be worrying is you don't know when you're going to hit the low points. So we talk about, okay, we know we're going to hit the low points. So what are going to be your strategies to help you get through the low point as quickly as possible? So for some athletes, that might be, oh, well, that I'm going to talk to the other runners more to get my mind off of the pain. Or that's when you pull in, grab your favorite snack from your bag, or that's when you put your earphones in and you listen to your favorite playlist. Whatever it is, the low points are coming, but we come up with strategies to help get the athletes through it. So I'm happy for people to contact me to ask any questions they have or just to network. I really enjoy connecting with other coaches and athletes. So my personal email is listed. And in terms of social media, I'm most active on Instagram, and that's my Instagram handle. And then people can also contact me or keep up with us on our website. So I really appreciate everyone's time, and thank you.
Yeah, that was amazing. I was nodding the entire time and so fascinated by all the subjects. There are a few questions, like I mentioned at the beginning, that a few people had sent in. And then we also have some questions that we wanted to ask you specifically. So the first question, and this is, I feel like, something that's common no matter what distance the athlete is racing, and maybe something that coaches kind of have to work with and deal with in terms of collecting that data in the first place. We kind of work off the assumption that we're just going to get data and then we can pore over it and then we can make changes and kind of give recommendations off that. But taking one step back from that is recommending an athlete maybe a good setup for them to collect the best data possible. So people typically think of that maybe as a sports watch. And that sort of use case, a coach that specifically coaches with power or recommends power-based training plans and running and racing strategies would maybe have a little bit more input about the types of data fields or what that athlete should be monitoring in real time. So, the coach can give all the coaching and workouts, but then you need that sort of like coach on the wrist, that sort of extension of yourself on the athlete's wrist to be able to show them that data in real time for them to act on. So the main question that this is sent from Edward here on the lines of managing power in things like steep uphills or things where athletes walk, maybe where there's a lot of oscillation between different types of, different power outputs. Do you have any recommendations for things like data fields or the smartwatch that you recommend for athletes to be able to just take a simple glance down at their wrist and stay kind of in the moment and hit that right target?
So in terms of how they're going to execute the actual race, I always say, don't worry about the live power or pace. Just put on the average elapsed power or pace for the distance that you've covered. There's also a nice feature on most watches where you can put in projected race time based on the pace and how things are going, which can be kind of nice and motivating for athletes because they're like, ooh, I know I want to try and go under 12 hours for this 100K. And I see, I'm going to hit that goal, or I'm just off it, so I'm going to increase my speed a bit. But always average, not live, because I find it stresses athletes out too much. And if you put too much energy into what your watch is saying in every single minute, every single second, that's lost energy. So the data is nice, but it's from an average point of view. So if you're doing a very hilly course, again, that's average is the best, because the data cannot be as accurate in terms of, if there's a lot of tree cover on a particular hill, the data is not going to be as accurate. If you start to hike or you're doing a hike run, the data is not going to be that accurate in terms of a live. So, but the average is going to be the best to take into account.
Yeah, and one of the last points that you made too is, so important that I feel like also maybe sometimes neglected is that mentality or psychology side. And there's something different that goes on. My furthest distance I've ever run is a 50K, but your mind goes to funny places and you interpret things very differently, I imagine, when you're 80K into a 100K race and you're all of a sudden looking down and seeing this live power output or your live pace changes and stuff. That's just one of the things that you want to be able to remove and take away those sort of stressors, because it is, energy, and you can't really take a gel for that sort of anxious energy and have that go away. One question that I had, because like I mentioned, my furthest distance that I've ever run at one time is a 50K, because I signed up to pace a marathon, and I thought, wouldn't it be fun to just run home right after the marathon? And it was very fun until about 2 kilometers left to go, and then I realized why people, don't just run 50Ks all the time. It got very, very difficult. But for athletes who have been road runners, like this athlete that you presented a case study on, and they want to increase their sights to ultra marathon distances, do you have any, like, maybe we can approach this from like a negative, a neutral, and a positive, like any cautionary tales for athletes that think they're ready to just jump up to the ultras, but maybe should take a little bit more time, maybe some general advice, and then also anybody that you've worked with or seen has had like a ton of success moving from those just up to 42K distances and then actually moving up to 50K and above?
I think the biggest problem I have with like converting a road marathon or half marathon runner to an ultra marathon runner is that it's not the volume of training that they're lacking. It's that they're shocked at how slowly they need to go, and they've done very little or no running in zone 1. So it's getting them used to running slowly, because you don't want the race, you don't want the 100K, this 100K race to be the first time that this athlete has had to run in zone 1. So it's really, as the race gets closer, it's almost, I don't like to use like periodization terms because each coach is so different, but whatever race they're preparing for, the pace gets more similar to race pace as the race gets closer. So that doesn't matter if it's a half marathon where you're trying to go super fast, then, the closer the half marathon gets, you do more race pace at half marathon pace. Well, if it's a 100-mile race, you do more hiking as the race gets closer. You do more zone 1 running. And I think that's the hardest concept for the road runners to get their head around is, oh my gosh, I have to practice hiking because I'm going to be hiking throughout 100K as well. It's not just going to be running. Some of the top athletes, sure, they can run 100K straight, but, most of us are going to be doing quite a bit of hiking as well. So if you haven't done hiking in your training, and then the race is the first time you're doing hiking. So it's really just changing your mindset about race pace and getting prepared for a specific race. But the volume, most of the road runners have done a really good, decent amount of volume. So that's not typically the hardest thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. You mentioned early in the presentation the concept of these pieces. And I was interested in following up on that, about any pieces in this multifactorial approach that you have used in the past and decided to maybe throw out and not consider them as highly important as these other pieces, or things you're considering adding in the future. So, we talk about psychology, we talk about the nutrition, the logistics, I think is something that a lot of people, even road, marathon, half marathon coaches, don't necessarily consider about taking the time to plan out logistics of a course. It's less important when you have a more supported course and you have, aid stations and stuff. But the concept of going out of the way and taking a look at logistics in particular, I feel like is something, and it's a piece that a lot of coaches might be able to stand to add into their own coaching repertoire. But has there been any piece that you've thrown out in the past, or anything that you're really hyped about or considering adding in the future?
Something that not necessarily thrown out, but have had to adjust is sometimes I get athletes who are currently doing a very low volume of training and want to do an ultra. And then I say, okay, we're going to work towards increasing your training load, increasing your volume, and they just aren't able to handle it. But I never tell an athlete that they can't do something. And I've been super surprised about how low of a volume some athletes can get away with and still do ultra marathon races. And we always have to respect, first and foremost, keeping that athlete healthy and happy. And I think sometimes athletes, especially with young children and a demanding career, we just can't increase the volume to what I would like for them to be, or maybe what I would become more comfortable for them to be at in order to be prepared. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, if their body can't handle it, then we have to stick to the volume that they're comfortable with, that their body can handle. And then we just show up on race day and we see what happens. And we've been pleasantly surprised more often than not. So that's something that I've kind of thrown out, is this chasing this specific number or weekly mileage. It's all about what the athlete can handle.
Sure. Yeah. Amazing. One other point, you mentioned this specific training strategy, which I feel in the normal shorter distance or road focused races, coaches don't typically prescribe, is that concept of like a 4-day block, or the very, very specific intensity, because it still is intensity. It's just intensity stretched out over that longer period of time, where I believe in this 4-day block, this specific queso is somewhere between 80 to 90 kilometers, but spread out in those different sort of sections each day. The question is not necessarily as much about the 4-day block, but it's more about the thinking away from a standard 7-day block. So people that are working typically think of maybe a Monday to Sunday or the Sunday to Saturday, and they structure their training that way, where you have to have at least one like interval workout or a quality session, maybe one day with like strides, and then a long run. And then just because the calendar says it's a new quote unquote week, then we go back and we just repeat that. Is there success that you found in not just using that same sort of thinking with prescribing training, whether that's that short concentrated block or extending it out based on athletes' specific unique demands and considerations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think using the 4-day block, it automatically changes several weeks, because we know that they need quite a bit of recovery going into the 4-day block to be able to successfully handle that load, and then quite a bit of recovery after in order for them to adapt to that load. And I found that athletes actually, they like that change in pace. They like that it's not the typical, Monday to Sunday. It's not the 3 weeks on, 1 week recovery. It's just a change in pace, and it's increases their motivation just by kind of mixing it up and saying, hey, this week we're just focusing on Thursday through Sunday or Friday through Monday, if that's the 4 days that they choose. So mixing it up increases motivation, and then it also allows us to just increase the specificity for preparing for a race, instead of just doing those typical 3-week build, 1 week off, and so on.
Yeah, I love that. There was like once upon a time when I experimented with like a 10-day block, and I thought that it was so freeing, where you just say like, I have an easy run, easy run with strides, and then a workout, and you just keep repeat it. And then at the end of that 9-day, you add an extra like easy day, and you just start it back over again. But it changes, how you interact with things and how you think about things. But I feel almost like I've heard of that so much more in the ultra world, or like non-typical, 5K through marathon sort of stuff. So it's very, very intriguing. Another question regarding the RPE scale that you had. I feel like if you presented an athlete with the 0 through 10, and you color coded it and you put descriptors on it, that would get them a certain way there. But because you do your due diligence as an expert coach, and you put the little arrows with some of those things that help with the communication, like this should feel like it's 1 hour, this should feel like it's about your 1 kilometer, 1 minute. The messaging helps the athlete understand. A lot of times as coaches, we can get really into the semantics, and we can get really, really into the definitions and the sports science and read these research papers. But then when we're trying to communicate those to the athletes and get the point across, the message kind of falls short. Have you found other types of messaging in your own coaching that has helped athletes, or have you found messaging from other coaches that you've tried to implement or kind of mimic and echo to help athletes actually understand when it comes to things that you're trying to get across to them?
Mm-hmm. So I love Jack Daniels. So I love the Jack Daniels spreadsheet. I found it on some deep dark Reddit forum. And I recently found the update, and it's super cool because the way he splits up, yes, he has training zones, but what I'll say is, okay, you're doing 1K repeats at 10K race pace instead of you're doing 1K repeats at zone 3. Because zone 3 or zone 4, like, it means different things depending on which app you're using, which watch you have. But athletes, they know 10K race pace, they know 5K race pace. And then we know that the easy runs are defined with, a larger range in pace, but we kind of say, okay, I know I'm not supposed to go past any faster than this pace on my easy days. So I find being very specific in terms of the intensity that I'm prescribing and describing like exactly the goal of the session instead of being vague about zones. And that's Jack Daniels really kind of turned me on to, hey, let's just be specific about what goal are we trying to achieve with this workout.
Let's talk one more specific question. You mentioned that the goal race for this case study was relatively flat, given the length of the race. The climbing wasn't more than 100 to 350 meters, depending on what source. So that is, I've seen races that have maybe that in a single mile or something like that, or a single 2 kilometer for these ultra distances where hiking is crucial and walking is crucial. When we talk about specificity for these types of events, do you ever have athletes actually practice what they might do? So at the end of like a 4-day block, you have them actually practice alternating that walking or like hiking and stuff like that. Do you have specific recommendations for maybe not even like how to implement that in training, but the mindset of how a coach might go about finding out if they need to implement that and make things specific in their training?
I think like the Thames Path Challenge is quite unique. Like in America and a lot of Europe, if once you're getting to the 100K distance, it's more common for it to be a mountain ultramarathon. So with the mountain races, I like to look at, okay, what's the climbing per kilometer or per mile? And then we kind of take a look at the gradients and we come up with walk, run, or walk strategies, depending on the athlete's ability level. So we really, again, it really comes down to race specificity. In terms of the Thames race, where it's not technical, and technically a high-level athlete would be able to probably run the whole race. For this athlete, it's going to be more about coming up with walk-run strategies to help reduce muscular fatigue, because his muscles are going to get really fatigued by being on a course where you can pretty much run the whole thing. So it's going to be the strategy around that will be more like, hey, you're going to be walking, coming into and out of aid stations, and you're going to be taking a break at this aid station. But so yeah, this is kind of new for me, a non-technical 100K. Even like Comrades Marathon, it's either a down run or an up run. So you still have to talk about, gradients and things like that. So, yeah, that's kind of new for me. But the mountain ultramarathons, we again study the course. We look at how much climbing per mile there is. We look at the specific climbs, and then we come up with walk run strategies based on that.
Yeah, amazing. One more time, if people would like to ask any follow-up questions or take a look at your website, follow on social media, can you give us those one more time?
Yeah, so you can contact me by email. My email is rejohansson@gmail.com. Our website is the performanceprojectllc.com, and you can find us on Instagram. If you type in the Performance Project, you'll find us.
Amazing. I want to say thank you again. We're really looking forward to getting this webinar out. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to follow up. And we will see you for the next coaching webinar in a few weeks. Thanks, everybody.